In this presentation, we're going to talk through some of the ways to consider BMP options and select those that best fulfill your water quality management goals. Based on the Kentucky Watershed Planning Guidebook, these are the steps of the planning process. At this point, you have evaluated land use and evaluated causes and sources of pollution. You have also analyzed water quality data to develop needed pollutant loading reductions and prioritized the areas for improvement or protection activities. Now you can put all this information together to develop management practices that enable water quality improvements. This is the information that is included in chapters 5 and 6, which are dedicated to exploring management options and developing a plan of action. Once BMP selections are finalized, you can include the relevant partners for technical and financial assistance, accompanying education needs, a project schedule with milestones, progress indicators, and follow-up monitoring plans. First, let's make sure that we're clear on what we mean by BMP, or Best Management Practice. A BMP is a technique, measure, or structural control that is used for a given set of conditions to manage the quantity and improve the quality of stormwater runoff in the most cost-effective manner. Remember, best is subjective and highly site-specific. The appropriateness of a practice is dependent on the site characteristics and unique situation. This slide provides a list of several of the ways that management practices help limit pollutant inputs to water bodies. They can reduce the availability of pollutants by limiting their application or use, such as reducing fertilizer or manure applications to crops. They can reduce the pollutants generated by the activity, such as using erosion control seeding to hold soil in place. They can slow the transport or delivery of pollutants by reducing the amount of water transported or by causing the pollutant to be deposited near its source of origin, such as through routing runoff through grass swales that encourage infiltration. They can also deposit the pollutant off-site before it reaches the water body. An example of this would be using manure storage facilities to contain the manure for later use during more appropriate application times. And they can remediate or intercept the pollutant before or after it's delivered to the water resource through a chemical or biological transformation, such as when a stormwater wetland cell traps and utilizes nutrients through natural processes. BMPs can be classified in many different ways. Two of these are according to scale and type. Scale-based classification is dependent on whether they are used on an individual lot or land parcel, installed community-wide, or applied at a watershed scale. These considerations are helpful in planning and estimating potential load reductions. In this graphic, you can see various stormwater BMPs located throughout an area or community, as well as by individual lots. The colors depict impervious surfaces in pink, beige, and white with hash marks, and green spaces. Runoff flow paths are indicated by arrows. Urban BMPs are sited throughout the area, including vegetated swales, porous pavement, bioretention green roofs, and rain barrels. We'll be talking more about these practices in the upcoming Urban BMPs module. BMPs can also be categorized by whether their structural form relates to a point, such as localized BMPs, or a linear configuration along a stream or water channel, or over an area. Examples of localized or point BMPs include constructed wetlands, infiltration basins, bioretention structures, rain gardens, and rain barrels, and wet and dry ponds. These methods all capture and treat runoff at specific points in the watershed through one or more approaches, such as detention, infiltration, evaporation, settling, and transformation of the pollutant. A linear BMP is located adjacent to stream channels and therefore has a narrow path. These BMPs can provide runoff filtration, nutrient uptake, and added benefits such as stream shading, wildlife habitat, and aesthetic values. Examples of linear BMPs include grassed swales, infiltration trenches, vegetated filter strips, and enhanced riparian buffer zones. Broader land-based strategies manage runoff from larger, less defined areas. Examples of area BMPs include green roofs, porous pavement, and preserved natural areas. At the larger watershed scale, you can assess the cumulative ability of BMPs to reduce the overall loading of a pollutant or multiple pollutants. One online modeling tool available for this type of assessment is the Soil and Water Assessment Tool, or SWAT, which was developed by the USDA. It uses GIS capabilities to simulate land-based changes and their effects on water quantity and quality. SWAT is widely used in assessing soil erosion prevention and control, other non-point source pollution controls, and regional management in watersheds. In this example, 5 types of BMPs were tested throughout a sub-watershed of the Minnesota River Basin to see how they reduce sediment loading. Since the majority of the land use was either used for row crop or livestock production, the BMPs related to agricultural land coverage. Water quality sampling data from 2001 through 2008 was used to calibrate a model predicting conditions in 2030 using BMP coverages, urban land predictions, and 2030 point source discharge estimates. This presentation of BMPs could have been approached in several different ways. BMPs can be categorized by the type of pollutant that's being targeted and addressed, such as sediment, organic enrichment, nutrients, or pathogens, the source of the pollution, such as practices that focus on either addressing non-point runoff sources or the point sources, or the type of strategy being used, whether it's structural, which are built facilities that capture runoff, treat it through chemical, physical, or biological means before it's discharged, or non-structural controls that typically involve changes in activities or behaviors. Examples of this might be an erosion control plan or a septic system maintenance education program. Or we can describe practices by land use type, with details of practices that are used to address activities involved in a specific land use, such as urban stormwater, agricultural, forestry, wastewater treatment, or resource extraction. The subsequent sections of this model will outline the practices primarily by land use type, with some differentiation between structural and non-structural practices. Before we dive into the various land use BMPs, we need to better understand the lens through which we'll evaluate and select them. Within the watershed planning process, there are recommended procedural steps. Here's an overview. First, we want to inventory what has been or is being accomplished in the watershed. Future projects and management practices should augment these efforts, and an analysis will allow you to determine where modifications are needed to existing programs, practices, or ordinances, and where new practices are needed. The next step involves quantifying the effectiveness of these existing management efforts. This will allow you to establish a baseline level of pollutant load reductions that are already occurring and will help guide the selection of additional practices. Steps 3 and 4 involve identifying new opportunities for implementing management measures. Based on the pollutant sources, you can locate critical areas where management measures will likely achieve the greatest pollutant load reductions. Once opportunities for pollutant load reductions are identified, you can match them with candidate management practices that can be used alone or in combination. This step will involve research into practice specifications to help you determine which ones have the greatest pollutant removal effectiveness under your existing conditions, which may be most feasible, and which practices may be most acceptable to the landowners. After researching these candidate management measures, you should have enough information to analyze each opportunity using the screening criteria that you develop. These are based on your critical areas, site conditions, and constraints, and will help you sort through different attributes of each practice so you can select the ones that are worthy of more detailed analysis. Then finally, you can better quantify predicted effectiveness and conduct the associated cost versus benefit analysis to make final recommendations for which practices to use. Once you have completed Chapter 4 of a watershed plan, you will have already done steps 1, 2, and 4. The other steps in the process still need completion. Step 7, to develop screening criteria to determine opportunities and constraints, is an important part of the process that's often given inadequate attention. You will want to compare and consider potential practices in light of your critical areas, goals, and objectives. Then look more closely at details such as load reduction estimates, legal requirements, physical constraints, costs, and added benefits. This allows you to reject some BMPs and offer up more feasible candidates. As we'll discuss more later and in Module 5 on likely partners for watershed planning, the local insights in this phase are crucial. You'll need to know where opportunities for BMP installations may be possible on public lands or private property with landowner permissions. You'll also glean info about feasibility and who is likely to be more willing to collaborate. After this review and local discussion, you should be able to propose a more refined list of management practices that can be included in your watershed action plans. Let's talk through some of the many factors to consider when deciding which BMPs are realistic for your watershed. In addition to their effectiveness at removing the targeted pollutants, BMP selection is also based on considerations such as technical feasibility. We may want to look at the land area required and the site constraints. We also want to look at the maintenance burden involved in maintaining them. There are also financial constraints, legal hurdles, community acceptance and support, impact on other related resources, and some added benefits that may be achieved from synergistic effects of working on similar related initiatives. We're going to go through each of these considerations individually in more depth on the following slides. In order to assess a BMP's ability to achieve needed load reductions, you can use a variety of approaches. We're going to look at these from the simplest to the most thorough and time-intensive. First, you can look for estimates of relative load reductions, such as low, medium, and high comparisons between BMPs. These are good for screening BMPs for further consideration. You can also look for literature values, which usually provide an average pollutant removal percentage for the BMP type. This is usually based on one or more monitoring studies in which performance was measured using a combination of flow and chemical monitoring. Then you can develop a spreadsheet tool that allows you to consider multiple scenarios and look at the pollutant loads, area treated, and percentage reductions expected. These first two simplified options can be appropriate for comparative analysis, but may lack sensitivity to precipitation, seasonal patterns, and storm events. If that level of analysis is needed and adequate data is available, you can also use a detailed watershed model. Models require significant input for the management techniques being considered, but can produce a much more accurate estimate of effectiveness. This field is developing as new tools are being created to assess the selection, placement, and cost of management measures. You can also use water quality monitoring to better understand a particular BMP. Usually the inflows and outflows, or upstream-downstream sites, are monitored for a limited number of rain events with multiple samples taken for each event. This information can then be used to help refine the practice and the accompanying watershed management approach. This graph shows the comparative effectiveness of various stormwater BMPs in removing total suspended solids. The blue plots show the total suspended solid concentrations of the influent entering the BMP, and the green plots show the concentration in the effluent leaving the BMP. You can see that there's a lot of variation in the change of concentrations among the same type of BMP within the individual whisker plot, as well as among the different BMPs. In general, it seems that bioretention and media filters, circled in green, show bigger reductions in TSS than the grass strips or swales, circled in red. The flow input rate could be causing the variance in effectiveness, as BMPs have differences in retention and treatment capabilities depending on flow. In practice, actual load reductions can also vary depending on such factors as the extent of the practice, the existing load level, and local features such as soils and hydrology. Although data on management practice effectiveness can be limited or unclear, the resources often provide insight on relative performance, such as shown by this graph. You'll need to focus on identifying the practice that will have the greatest likelihood of achieving the water quality goals. This excerpt from a table in the EPA's Handbook for Developing Watershed Plans shows how a community can compare urban structural stormwater BMPs. Both hydrologic and pollutant removal effectiveness are rated from poor to moderate to high. This allows users to also consider the multiple benefits of each practice. For example, the first row provides ratings for bioretention. This practice rates very well for intercepting flow and moderate for the other hydrologic functions of infiltration, evaporation, and reduced peak flow. But its pollutant removal potential is very good for all categories, including nutrients, fecal coliform, metals, and temperature. Or, as in this example, you can use percent load reduction estimates to make rough estimates or total load reductions over an entire watershed. Suppose your watershed has 10 potential sites where conventional till could be converted to no-till practice, enabling a 75% reduction in sediment load. You can calculate loading rates for each site based on variations in slope and soil composition and the area. This would be in tons per acre per year in this example. You can then estimate that converting to no-till on these 10 sites will remove approximately 2,672 tons of sediment from the receiving water body, reducing the net load to 892 tons per year. If you have the relevant data and the capacity to pursue BMP evaluation through modeling, there are existing models that specialize in agricultural, urban, or mixed land use scenarios. Each has its own strengths and weaknesses. We won't be discussing these models further, but you're encouraged to refer to the EPA's Handbook for Developing Watershed Plans for more information. They're all described there in detail, including the types of practices they consider and their strengths and limitations. To help you find information on stormwater BMP performance, one of the more useful resources is the International Stormwater BMP Database at www.bmpdatabase.org. It serves as a clearinghouse of available BMPs and their related performance, design, and cost information. You can also find and submit related scientific research into BMP effectiveness. On the home page, you can click on the Start Here link to see the various levels of information provided. Low-intensity users, such as public officials or those needing quick, simple answers, are directed to the more basic information, including the 2016 BMP Summary Report. Mid-intensity users, such as consultants, public works staff, or possibly watershed coordinators, are directed to more detailed guidance and research results. There is also a selection for those who are new to BMP monitoring and may want to develop their own study of a practice's effectiveness. If you're looking for information about agricultural BMPs, the NRCS maintains a database called the National Conservation Practice Standards. Since the national database was developed in the western United States with its unique conditions, Kentucky has its own technical guidance on how practices should most effectively be installed in this state. The access to Kentucky's Field Office Technical Guide is somewhat tricky since it does not link directly from the national database website. After entering the web address listed here, select Kentucky, then Section 4, then Old Section 4, then Conservation Practices. This will show you the listing of practices with their associated specifications for Kentucky.
In addition to reviewing pollutant removal effectiveness, there are many other criteria to consider in reviewing your list of potential BMPs. We'll begin to step through these, beginning with technical feasibility. A primary consideration for technical feasibility is property ownership. If it's public, that could potentially make a project easier to carry out and fund. If it's private, you'll need to convince the owner or owners of the properties. Property access is another major consideration. Will you be able to freely and safely access the site for BMP construction and maintenance? If you're dealing with a private owner, you may need to obtain written consent in a legal document. Land characteristics relate to site access feasibility in that they may make it difficult or dangerous to access the chosen site. For instance, very wet areas may make construction unfeasible, causing more harm than good at the site. In contrast, large open areas may be more amenable to BMP installation. It is always important to review on-site infrastructure such as road crossings, water and sewer lines, natural gas pipelines, buried electrical lines. The presence of these features can make BMP installation unfeasible. Alternatively, there may be infrastructure on the site that lends itself to upgrades, such as a stormwater outfall that could be retrofitted with enhanced settling features. It is always helpful to arrange a site visit with relevant permitting agency staff who can point out some of these issues for you. You also need to consider both the short-term installation costs and the longer-term operation and maintenance costs of the BMP under consideration. These estimates may be available in guidance manuals, such as those mentioned earlier in the presentation, or in other clearinghouse sources such as the Center for Watershed Protection or the US EPA. You should use local or regional cost estimates when possible. Otherwise, use the most recent national estimates. You can also use cost estimates to further develop BMP comparison metrics by calculating the per unit cost of pollutant removal. By using the area cost of a BMP, for instance, the amount of money that you'd spend per acre, you can deduce the cost of removing the pollutant, for instance, the cost per pounds of pollutant removed. This allows you to compare one type of BMP to another to decide what's the best fit for your project. Most BMPs will require ongoing maintenance to ensure their continued effectiveness. Consider who will be responsible and how to ensure it takes place. Maintenance of BMPs on private property are usually the responsibility of the property owner, but MS4 permanent communities may at times assume the responsibility for structures on private properties. Sometimes green infrastructure gets a bad rap because the practices are not maintained and therefore do not function properly. For this reason, some communities limit their use. To avoid problems and encourage the use of green infrastructure, maintenance requirements and agreements are essential and should be agreed upon at installation. This photo shows an example of a bioretention area or rain garden that needs regular weeding to keep it attractive and maintain public support for this practice. Other examples of common maintenance concerns that need to be addressed are the inflows and outflows either are draining too slow or too fast, draining or clogging issues, undesirable vegetation such as weeds or invasive species, too much sediment eroding into or out of the management practice, trash that is carried in and trapped, becoming unsightly and interfering with the practice effectiveness, Diverted or improper flow path into or out of the practice can also diminish its effectiveness. And structural failure of the practice. You also need to identify any legal or regulatory requirements and whether or not these pose significant constraints for the BMP under consideration. For example, if the BMP involves work in the stream channel, you'll be required to obtain a Section 404 permit from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and a 401 permit from the state for dredge and fill activities. Again, it is helpful to invite potential regulatory agency staff to a site visit to help with identifying legal hurdles to BMP implementation. Module 5 of the Kentucky Watershed Academy will provide more insights from partnering agencies and organizations on the topic, as we'll be hearing from representatives about their programs and the technical and financial assistance that may be able to provide. Ultimately, community support and social acceptance can really help drive which BMPs are utilized. How is the practice perceived by nearby landowners? Is there support or resistance? If it's resisted, why? Are there potential nuisances associated with it that need to be explained or addressed, such as ponded water, weed growth, or mosquito outbreaks? Is it possible to address some of these issues through more strategic practice placement? For example, putting it away from busy neighborhoods, or maybe adding recreational features to draw people in and to help them better understand and feel comfortable with the practice? Can you involve the residents in open discussion of activities that help tailor the project selection and design to local sensibilities? And is the BMP project compatible with current land planning objectives? Some practices may help reduce pollutants in addition to those being targeted. These secondary or added benefits can help a BMP to be more favorable in the selection process. For example, erosion control measures for reduced sediment loading can also reduce phosphorus that is absorbed into the silt and clay particles. Therefore, an erosion control practice such as a grass buffer strip may help to reduce sediment loads as well as the transport of particulate phosphorus. Habitat enhancement is another potential secondary benefit of some BMPs. For example, a riparian buffer to reduce sediment and nutrient loading can also create a habitat corridor for birds and other wildlife, as well as providing shading for stream and possible recreational features. Or, while reducing the targeted pollutant, a practice may inadvertently increase the contributions from a different pollutant. An example would be the use of conservation tillage to reduce soil erosion. This practice can create larger soil pore spaces or porosity, which enables increased nitrate leaching through the soil. In these situations, it is especially important to be mindful of the amount and timing of fertilizer additions to the crops. Or a stormwater BMP could exacerbate peak flows if the timing of its stormwater releases coincides with the delayed upstream flow. Multiple BMPs can be combined to achieve greater load reductions. When the same runoff is treated by more than one practice, the configuration is referred to as a treatment train. This approach may apply to on-site and regional BMPs that work together to remove pollutants using combinations of hydraulic, physical, biological, and chemical methods. In this example, 7 approaches are used to reduce pollutants before the water enters the receiving body. Pollutant prevention is encouraged by pet waste collection stations. Source control is achieved through street sweeping. On-site treatment is accomplished through parking lot bioinfiltration areas. A regional structure allows for additional infiltration and settling before the water flows into the receiving water. It's important to realize that the effectiveness of the treatment train practices is not necessarily cumulative. A second practice may treat an already reduced load after the runoff has been pretreated, so it is inaccurate to simply add associated load reductions to predict an overall reduction. Once you've collected all this information, it may be helpful for you to create a ranking table with the evaluation criteria you've considered. This example provides subjective ratings of 1 to 4, with 1 being the lowest and 4 being the highest. It's assumed that proper installation and maintenance of the BMPs and accompanying education and outreach to encourage adoption. Averages of the BMP scores can help with selecting practices for implementation. You can present these summary scores to your stakeholder groups to assist them with the final selection process. If they disagree with some of the ratings, be sure to make changes to reflect the local input. We will delve much further into the stakeholder partnership discussion in Module 5, but it's important to pause here to consider who should be at the table forming these groups and individuals in the BMP selection process. First and foremost are local leaders and community residents. Watershed projects should be community driven to better ensure their long-term acceptance and success. When making BMP decisions, it's also important to have representatives present who can answer questions that may arise about construction, maintenance, costs, and other issues. For example, if someone in the farming community is not familiar with a proposed practice, it would be helpful to have a soil conservation district representative or an NRCS agent present to explain how it works and help increase familiarity and confidence with using it. The better that you ensure initial questions and concerns are adequately addressed, the more likely the practice is to be implemented. In the final selection process, you will evaluate the candidate practices using either a spreadsheet or modeling tools to evaluate the relative load reductions, cost and benefits, social acceptance, and other criteria to come up with your listing for the final management strategies. When developing BMPs for watersheds with multiple sources, make sure that your final selections address all major sources and are complementary. By working from upstream headwater areas to downstream areas, you may be able to demonstrate earlier successes and can help build support for continued efforts. Downstream projects can be adjusted and developed based on previous headwater results. In summary, a watershed planning mindset recognizes the limited resources of time, people, and money, with the aim being to select the most effective and efficient solutions to achieve water quality goals. Being mindful of these general overarching considerations will help in making realistic recommendations for your watershed area. Thank you.